The golden warmth of the interior dining room bled through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting a mocking glow onto the sidewalk. Inside, the air was climate-controlled and fragrant with truffle oil and expensive perfume. Outside, the night air was sharp, carrying the scent of exhaust and the damp chill of the city. Chantel sat at the small, white metal table, her posture slightly slouched, her fingers tracing the edge of her green silk clutch. She felt the weight of the hostess's gaze from behind the glass, a look that wasn't just an assessment of a customer, but a dismissal of a person. To the staff of Leclet, she was an aesthetic inconsistency, a blemish on the curated minimalist vision they sold to the elite. Dune stood a few feet away, his back to the bustling street. He didn't look at the menu the hostess had practically tossed onto the table. His eyes were fixed on the manager, who stood inside the warmth, adjusting a cufflink with an air of smug finality. The manager looked at Chantel as if she were a piece of faulty decor, then turned back to the ledger, satisfied that the problem had been moved out of sight. But the silence between Dune and the glass was heavy with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the silence of a man who had been defeated. It was the silence of a predator marking a territory that was about to be reclaimed. He noticed the way Chantel pulled her shoulders in, trying to make herself smaller, trying to endure the cold as she always did. He saw the flicker of shame in her eyes, the shame of a woman who had asked for a normal night and instead received a public reminder that, in some worlds, she would always be outside. The manager looked up, catching Dune's stare through the glass. He offered a tight, professional smile, the kind used to placate someone you believe is beneath you. He had no idea that the man in the simple charcoal suit could erase his career with a 3-minute conversation. He didn't see the "that's his wife" reality behind Dune's cold, dark eyes. To the manager, she was just another customer who didn't fit the brand. To Dune, she was the reason he allowed the city to keep standing. Dune didn't move toward the table. He didn't sit. He simply stood there, a dark pillar against the golden light of the interior, watching the manager's smile begin to waver under the sheer pressure of his gaze. The contrast was complete. The warmth they were denied, the cold they were offered, and the storm that was about to break from the man who belonged to both worlds. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but the light seemed to die before it reached the heavy obsidian desk where Dune sat. He was already deep into the life, a series of encrypted ledgers and silent nods to men who moved like shadows. Chantel stood in the doorway, watching the way his jaw tightened as he read a report. This was his natural habitat, a world of cold variables and absolute control. It was the world she had married into, but today, she wanted to borrow him back from it. "Dune," she said softly. He didn't look up immediately, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, acknowledging her presence before his eyes did. When he finally raised his gaze, the lethal sharpness softened, replaced by a quiet, observant stillness. "You're dressed for the city," he noted, his voice a low resonance that filled the room. "I found place." "Leclet," Chantel said, stepping into the room. She kept her voice steady, hiding the small ache of hope. "It's quiet. Minimalist. They say the chef is an artist." Dune leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. He knew every high-end establishment in the city, but more importantly, he knew the political temperature of every room. "You're sure about this one? It's a hive for the old money elite. It won't be quiet for someone like me." "It will be," she insisted, moving to the edge of the desk, "if you leave the life behind for just 2 hours. No security details inside. No scanning the exits. No half-dozen black SUVs idling at the curb." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes tracing the determination in her face. He saw the way she was holding her breath. She wasn't asking for a meal. She was asking for a sanctuary. She wanted to remember what it felt like to be a couple rather than a power dynamic. "You're asking me to walk in unarmed and unshielded," he said, though there was no fear in his tone, only a clinical assessment of the risk. "I'm asking you to trust me," she countered. "And to trust that for one night, the world can just be a place where we eat dinner." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, a rare, dangerous expression that was for her alone. He reached out, his hand resting briefly over hers on the desk. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the cold stone of the room. "I'll be alone," he promised.
No men.
"No distractions." "You promise?" "I promise." He meant it, but as he watched her leave the room to prepare, his gaze drifted back to the security monitors on his desk. He would keep his word, but he knew what she often forgot. Normalcy was a luxury their world rarely permitted, and the higher the status of the room, the sharper the knives usually were. The evening air hung heavy with a scent of rain and expensive gasoline as the sedan glided to a halt in front of Leclet. There was no motorcade, no screeching tires, and no wall of black-suited men to clear the sidewalk. When the door opened, Dean stepped out alone. He wore a simple charcoal suit, tailored with surgical precision but devoid of the usual sharp lines of a tie or the glint of a watch that cost more than a suburban home. He looked less like a man who controlled the city's pulse and more like a high-level executive finishing a long day, unassuming, understated, and deceptively accessible. Chantel watched him from the curb, her heart performing a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She had seen him in tactical gear, in silk robes, and in custom tuxedos, but this version of him, this unarmed version, felt the most dangerous of all. He was walking into a room without his armor, testing whether the world's respect for him was rooted in his character or merely in the fear of his reach. "You look." Chantel started, her voice catching as he reached her side. "Human." Dean offered, his voice a low, smooth vibration. He tucked his hands into his pockets, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes remained a constant, roving radar. He wasn't wearing a weapon, but the way he moved suggested his entire body was one. "Elegant," she corrected, smoothing the silk of her emerald dress. "You look like a man on a date." "That is the objective," he said, though his gaze lingered on a black SUV parked too far down the street for a standard valet service. He dismissed it with a microscopic tilt of his chin. For tonight, he was a ghost to his own organization. He offered her his arm, his touch firm and grounding. As they approached the heavy oak doors of the restaurant, Chantel noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The valet didn't rush forward with the usual frantic energy reserved for the Han name. The doorman didn't bow. They saw the charcoal suit and the lack of an entourage, and they categorized them instantly. They saw a handsome man and a beautiful black woman, and in their world of curated tiers, they saw standard. Dean felt the shift, too. He felt the absence of the deference he was accustomed to, the way the staff's eyes lingered just a second too long, searching for a reason to care. He didn't tighten his grip or harden his expression. Instead, he leaned into the silence, a cold curiosity blooming in his chest. He was curious to see how the world treated the man when they couldn't see the king. "Ready?" he asked quietly as they stepped into the foyer. Chantel nodded, though the sudden chill of the air conditioning felt like a warning. They were inside now, and for the first time in her life, she realized that being normal was going to be the hardest thing they had ever tried to be. The foyer of Leclet was a temple of hushed tones and expensive scent. The air was cool, vibrating with a soft, rhythmic pulse of jazz that felt more like a social barrier than music. As they stepped onto the polished stone floor, the hostess looked up from a sleek, white marble podium. She was groomed to perfection, her smile a practiced, neutral mask designed to welcome the wealthy and discourage the unwanted. Her eyes landed on Dean first. For a split second, the neutral mask fractured. There was a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, a widening of the pupils, a flicker of pure, unadulterated recognition. Even without his usual entourage, his presence was a physical weight in the room. He didn't need a crown. The way he held his shoulders, the stillness in his hands, and the lethal intelligence in his gaze screamed of a man who moved mountains with a whisper. The hostess's smile transformed, becoming warmer, more subservient. She leaned forward, her body language angling toward him as if drawn by a magnetic force. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice dropping into a melodic, respectful register. "Welcome to Leclet." Then, her gaze drifted to the woman at his side. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. As the hostess's eyes settled on Chantel, the warmth evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical assessment. She looked at Chantel's voluminous curls, the deep emerald of her dress, and the rich mahogany of her skin, and her expression flattened into a look of profound indifference. It wasn't a look of confusion. It was the look of someone seeing a piece of luggage that didn't match a luxury set. The hostess didn't acknowledge Chantel with a nod or a greeting. She simply looked back at Diyun, her eyes effectively erasing Chantel from the foyer. "Reservation name?" she asked, her tone returning to the polite, robotic professional she had been trained to be. "Diyun," he replied. His voice was lower now, vibrating with a tonal quality that Chantel recognized as a warning, a low growl before a strike. The hostess tapped her tablet with a manicured nail. "Ah, yes. Of course. We have been expecting you." She paused, her smile returning to her lips as she looked only at him. "A party of one, is it?" The silence that followed was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating. Chantel felt the familiar, hot prickle of humiliation behind her eyes. She stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, her hand tightening slightly on her clutch. She was right there, her arm linked with his, yet she had been made invisible by a single, deliberate choice of words. Diyun didn't blink. He didn't look at Chantel, but she felt the muscle in his forearm turn to iron beneath her touch. He stared at the hostess, his expression unreadable, yet the air in the foyer seemed to drop 5 degrees. The hostess kept her smile fixed, but a small bead of sweat began to form at her temple. She had intended to insult the extra, but she was beginning to realize she had just poked a sleeping god. The silence that followed the hostess's question wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized like the air before a lightning strike. Diyun didn't move a single muscle, yet the energy radiating from him shifted from a calm, observant stillness to something serrated and lethal. He didn't look at the tablet or the lobby. He kept his eyes locked on the hostess, watching the way her forced, professional smile began to twitch under the weight of his scrutiny. "No," Diyun said. His voice was a low, velvet rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "A party of 2. The hostess blinked, her eyelashes fluttering in a frantic attempt to reset her composure. She didn't look at Chantel. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the empty space behind Diyun as if searching for a business associate or a second man who simply hadn't walked through the door yet. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice tightening with a desperate kind of politeness. "Our records indicate a singular booking. Perhaps there was a clerical error? We are strictly at capacity this evening for the main dining hall." Chantel felt the heat of the room's golden light turn cold against her skin. It was a practiced erasure. By refusing to even acknowledge her presence as a participant in the conversation, the hostess was attempting to turn her into an accessory, an uninvited guest, a coat to be checked at the door. Chantel felt her hand tremble slightly where it rested on Diyun's arm, but she refused to let go. She forced her chin upward, her voluminous curls casting a defiant shadow, even as the sting of being uncounted settled in her chest. "There is no error," Diyun replied. He took a single step closer to the marble podium, not to intimidate, but to occupy the space with a finality that could not be ignored. "My wife and I are here for our reservation." The word wife hung in the air like a physical barrier. The hostess's eyes finally, briefly, collided with Chantel's. There was no apology in that look, only a flickering resentment, as if Chantel were a complication in a perfectly curated machine. The hostess looked back at her tablet, her fingers hovering over the screen. "I see," she murmured, her tone losing its melodic warmth. "One moment. I will have to consult with the manager regarding our physical constraints." She turned away, leaving them standing in the center of the foyer. The jazz continued to play, indifferent and smooth, while the couples behind them in line began to whisper. Diyun didn't turn to look at them. He reached across his body, his hand covering Chantel's where it gripped his arm. His touch was scorching, a silent promise that while the room might try to erase her, he was the only one whose recognition mattered. But Chantel could see the reflection in the glass. The golden interior was a world away, and they were still standing on the threshold, being weighed, and found wanting by a girl with a tablet. The minutes began to stretch, each one a silent indictment of their presence. They were left standing in the center of the foyer, a small island of stillness in a sea of choreographed movement. To their left, the heavy glass doors of the main dining room acted as a transparent border, a window into a world of golden light and effortless belonging that felt increasingly out of reach. Chantel kept her eyes fixed forward, her posture an armor of practiced elegance, but she couldn't ignore the friction of the room. A young couple arrived behind them, a man in a sharp, trendy blazer and a woman whose pale silk dress shimmered like a pearl. They didn't have a reservation name that carried weight, but they had the look. The hostess, returning to the podium with a renewed, sugary warmth, didn't ask them to wait. She didn't consult a manager. With a graceful wave of her hand and a melodic, "Right this way," she swept them past the glass border and into the warmth. Diyun stood beside Chantel, his hands still tucked into his pockets. He wasn't looking at the hostess or the couples being ushered inside. He was watching the reflection in the glass. He saw the way the manager, visible just beyond the partition, glanced toward the foyer and then leaned in to whisper something to a waiter, gesturing subtly toward the door. The manager didn't look back. He simply turned away, adjusting a centerpiece on a table that sat empty and perfectly set. 7 minutes. 8. The air in the foyer felt thinner, the soft jazz now sounding like a rhythmic mockery. Another group was seated, 3 women laughing quietly, their diamonds catching the foyer's spotlights. They walked past Chantel as if she were a statue, a part of the architecture they didn't need to acknowledge. Chantel felt the cold of the marble floor seeping through the soles of her heels. She felt the weight of the aesthetic they were failing to meet. She looked at Diyun, her eyes searching for a sign that they could leave, that they could find a place where the air didn't feel like a judgment. But Diyun's face was a mask of granite. He wasn't waiting for a table anymore. He was counting. He was documenting the seconds of her humiliation, recording the names of those who were allowed through the border while she stood in the dark. By the 10th minute, the hostess finally looked up again. Her expression was no longer subservient or even polite. It was the look of someone delivering a final, inconvenient truth. She didn't walk toward them. She stayed behind her marble barricade, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the music. "Mr. Diyun," she said, her eyes skipping over Chantel as if she were a shadow. "The manager has completed the seating review. If you'll follow me." She didn't lead them toward the glass doors. She turned toward the narrow hallway that led to the rear of the building, toward the drafty air of the terrace. The message was clear. They had been measured, and for this room, they were not the right shape. The manager appeared from the shadows of the hallway like a ghost of corporate perfection. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like an architect of exclusivity, his suit pressed to a razor's edge and his expression fixed in a mask of practiced regret. He ignored the empty, candlelit tables that sat like islands of gold within the main room, his focus narrowing entirely on Diyun, as if by focusing on the man, he could successfully pretend the woman beside him didn't exist. "Mr. Diyun," the manager began, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. "I apologize for the delay. We take our reservations very seriously, but we have had a slight complication with the interior layout tonight." Diyun didn't move. He stood with the terrifying stillness of a storm held in place by sheer will. "The table I booked is empty," he said, his voice low and clinical. "I can see it from here." The manager's gaze flickered toward the dining room, then back to Diyun. His eyes never once landed on Chantel. "That table is currently unserviceable for our current flow. You see, Leklit isn't just a restaurant. It is a curated experience. Every seat, every guest, is part of a specific visual narrative we maintain for our clientele." He paused, his smile tightening into something brittle. "It is an issue of brand consistency. Aesthetic considerations, if you will." The words hung in the cool air, sharp and poisonous. Chantel felt the blood rush to her face, a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the most polite way she had ever been told she was an eyesore. The aesthetic they sought was one of pale silk and European heritage, a visual language that did not include her voluminous curls or the deep, rich mahogany of her skin. She was being told, in the most sophisticated language possible, that she was a blemish on their perfection. Aesthetic considerations, Diyun repeated. The words sounded heavy in his mouth, like coins being placed on the eyes of the dead. He looked at the manager, his dark eyes tracing the man's features with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. You are choosing a look over a client. I am choosing the integrity of the house, the manager corrected softly, his arrogance finally beginning to bleed through the politeness. He gestured toward the darkened hallway leading to the rear. We have prepared a lovely, secluded spot on the terrace. It is private, away from the distractions of the main floor. It would be much more appropriate for your party. Chantel felt Diyun's arm turn to stone. She reached out, her fingers grazing his sleeve, wanting to pull him away, to flee before the silence broke. But Diyun didn't move. He was looking at the manager as if he were already a ghost. He wasn't just hearing an insult. He was witnessing a confession. The manager had just defined the boundary of his world, and in doing so, he had signed the restaurant's death warrant. The glass door clicked shut behind them, severing the connection to the golden warmth of the interior. The terrace was an afterthought of stone and iron, shadowed and exposed to the biting draft that funneled between the high-rises. A single, flickering candle sat in a glass hurricane lamp on their table, its flames struggling against the wind. It was quiet, but not the peaceful quiet Chantel had envisioned. It was the silence of a broom closet, a place where things were kept so the real guests didn't have to see them. Chantel sat down, the cold metal of the chair biting through the thin silk of her emerald dress. She felt the sudden, sharp prickle of goosebumps on her arms, but she forced her features into a mask of composure. She reached for the menu, her fingers trembling slightly, and offered Diyun a small, fragile smile. It's actually very private out here, she whispered, her voice sounding thin against the city's distant hum. Just like I wanted. Diyun did not sit immediately. He stood at the edge of the terrace, his charcoal suit absorbing the shadows. He wasn't looking at the view. He was looking back through the glass at the main dining room. He watched a waiter present a bottle of vintage wine to the couple in the aesthetic seats. He watched the manager laugh at a joke made by a man in a velvet blazer. He was cataloging. He finally sat, but he didn't reach for the menu. His hands remained flat on the table, the knuckles white. He watched the way Chantel tucked her hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she only used when she was trying to hide her hurt. He noticed the way the server, appearing 5 minutes too late, placed the water glasses down with a sharp clack, failing to even offer a greeting. He noticed that their table didn't have the linen napkins the guests inside enjoyed. Every second that passed was another line item in a mental ledger of debt. Every shiver that racked Chantel's frame was a fresh insult he burned into his memory. He saw her try to take a sip of water, her teeth clicking against the glass, yet she still tried to maintain the lie of a normal dinner. Chantel, he said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to still the wind. I'm fine, Diyun. Really. The bread will be warm, and we can just... You are freezing, he interrupted, his eyes meeting hers. They weren't filled with the heat of anger, but with the absolute zero of a finished decision. He didn't offer her his jacket. He knew a piece of wool wouldn't fix the cold that had been intentionally forced upon her. He looked at the flickering candle, then back at the glass doors. He had seen enough. The normalcy she had asked for was dead, murdered by a manager's vanity. Now there was only the consequence. The server returned, moving with a sluggish indifference that suggested their table was a low-priority chore. He didn't offer a wine list or a description of the specials. He simply hovered, pen poised over a stained notepad, eyes drifting toward the warmth of the glass doors. Are we ready? The server asked, his voice flat. Chantel opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps order something warm to stop the shivering in her limbs, but she felt the air beside her sharpen. Diyun didn't look at the server. He didn't look at the menu. He remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the table like two granite weights. We won't be ordering, Diyun said. The server's brow furrowed. I'm sorry, you have a minimum spend for the terrace. Get your manager, Diyun interrupted. It wasn't a shout. It was a command delivered with the terrifying weight of a final judgment. The server hesitated, sensing for the first time that the man in the charcoal suit was not the unimportant guest they had categorized him to be. He retreated quickly, disappearing through the glass. Moments later, the manager emerged, smoothing his silk tie, his face fixed in a mask of exasperated patience. "Is there a problem with the seating, Mr. Dune? I thought the privacy would suit your party." Dune stood up. The movement was slow and fluid, but the effect was immediate. The manager stepped back, his arrogance faltering as Dune's shadow fell across him. Dune reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, embossed business card. He didn't hand it over. He placed it on the cold metal table and slid it toward the manager. "You mentioned brand consistency," Dune said, his voice a low, clinical rasp. "You mentioned aesthetic considerations. You chose the look of your room over the respect due to my wife." The manager glanced down at the card. As he recognized the seal of the holding company and the name etched in gold, the color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. "Mr. Han, I didn't realize. I was simply following the—" "It is 8:15 p.m., Dune said, cutting through the man's frantic stuttering. "By midnight, this restaurant will be closed. Not for the evening. Permanently." "Sir, you can't possibly." "By midnight," Dune repeated, leaning in until he was inches from the manager's ear. "The lights will be out, the locks will be changed, and your aesthetic will be a matter of public record. You have 3 hours to decide how you'll explain to your staff why you destroyed their livelihoods for the sake of a seating chart." He turned to Chantel and offered his hand. His touch was no longer cold. It was a protective fire. Chantel took it, rising from the chair with her head held high, the humiliation of the last hour replaced by a strange, soaring clarity. As they walked toward the exit, they didn't look back at the golden interior or the empty tables. Dune led her past the stunned hostess and out into the night, where a single black sedan now waited at the curb, its engine humming like a heartbeat. The dinner was over, but the consequence had just begun. The interior of the sedan was a silent vault of leather and shadows. The city lights smeared across the tinted windows in long, neon ribbons, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of an approaching storm. Chantel sat back against the seat, the heat from the car's vents finally beginning to thaw the chill in her bones, but her gaze remained fixed on Dune. He hadn't spoken since they crossed the threshold of the restaurant, his profile etched in the dim light of the dashboard like a sculpture of cold marble. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a secondary, encrypted phone, a device that didn't exist on any public record. He didn't dial a number. He tapped a single icon. The call was answered on the first ring, though no voice spoke from the other end. "Asset review," Dune said. His voice was lower than a whisper, a clinical vibration that felt like a scalpel cutting through the silence. "The Lecklet Holding Group. Identify the primary debt holders and the current lease underwriting for the Central District property." He waited, his eyes tracking the passing streetlights with a rhythmic, predatory focus. Chantel watched him, realizing that this was the side of him she had tried to wish away for the evening, the architect of ruin. There was no anger in his tone, no heat of a man seeking a petty revenge. This was a mechanical correction. "Leverage points," Dune continued after a moment, acknowledging the data being fed into his ear. "I want a high-interest bridge loans transferred to our offshore subsidiary by 10:30 p.m. Trigger the immediate audit of their commercial insurance policy. If there's a single building code violation or a payroll discrepancy in the last 5 years, I want it on the desk of the district licensing board within the hour." He paused, his thumb tracing the edge of the phone. "And notify the primary supplier. Tell them their contract with the hospitality group is terminated, effective immediately. We will absorb the cancellation fees. They are to cease all deliveries to the kitchen before the breakfast shift." He ended the call without a goodbye and set the phone in the center console. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a structure whose foundation had just been dissolved. "You didn't have to go that far," Chantel said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet cabin. Dune turned his head toward her. The lethal sharpness in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, focusing on her with an intensity that was both protective and absolute. They didn't just give us a bad table, Chantel. They attempted to define your value by the darkness of the patio. In my world, that is a structural defect. And a building with a structural defect cannot be allowed to stand. He reached over, his hand covering hers. His palm was warm, a stark contrast to the cold glass of the restaurant they had left behind. By the time you wake up tomorrow, the aesthetic of this city will have shifted. The silence in the car was broken not by a voice, but by the rhythmic, persistent vibration of Chantel's phone. She pulled it from her clutch, the screen's glow illuminating the sharp lines of her face. A news alert from a premier financial journal sat at the top of her notifications, followed by a frantic string of social media posts from the city's elite food critics. 27 minutes, she whispered, her eyes scanning the headlines. Diyun, look. She turned the screen toward him. The lead story, updated seconds ago, was a lightning strike to the hospitality industry. Leclerc parent company files for emergency restructuring amidst credit collapse. Below the headline, the reporting was clinical and cold. A sudden and unforeseen withdrawal of primary capital had triggered a cross-default clause in the group's commercial leases. Within less than half an hour, the restaurant's credit lines, the very oxygen that allowed it to exist in the city's most expensive district, had been vacuumed out. Diyun didn't look at the phone. He kept his gaze on the road, his expression as unreadable as the obsidian dashboard. A building without a foundation cannot withstand a change in the weather, he said. His voice was devoid of triumph. It carried only the flat finality of a mathematical truth. The digital ripple was already turning into a tidal wave. On a popular dining app, a red banner appeared over Leclerc's profile. Closed for business. On social media, videos were already surfacing from disgruntled patrons standing outside the oak doors, filming as the golden interior lights began to flicker and die. The aesthetic the manager had protected so fiercely was being dismantled in the dark, replaced by the chaotic reality of a business in freefall. Chantel watched the comments scroll by. People were confused, asking how a restaurant with a 3-month waiting list could evaporate in under an hour. They didn't understand that the waiting list was a social construct, easily erased by the man sitting beside her. She felt a strange, cold shiver, not from the patio air, but from the realization of the sheer scale of his reach. He hadn't just closed a restaurant. He had deleted a landmark from the city's social map because it had failed to respect the woman he loved. The manager, Chantel said, her voice trailing off as she imagined the scene inside the dining room. What happens to him now? Diyun steered the car onto the bridge, the river shimmering like liquid lead below them. He is currently discovering that his brand integrity has no market value, he replied. He spent the evening trying to decide who belonged inside. Now he is finding out that the inside no longer exists. He reached over, his hand briefly covering hers. The warmth of his touch was the only thing in the car that felt real, a stark contrast to the digital destruction unfolding on the screen. The city lights continued to blur past, indifferent to the fact that one of its most exclusive sanctuaries had just been turned into a ghost. The car slowed as it entered the private tunnel leading to their residence, the hum of the electric motor the only sound in the opulent cabin. Chantel watched the news cycle on her screen begin to shift from shock to a cold, forensic analysis of the restaurant's demise. The term hostile acquisition was being thrown around, but it felt too loud, too clumsy for what Diyun had actually done. How? She asked, her voice barely a breath. A place like that, it was the center of the city's social life. You didn't just hurt them, Diyun. You erased them. How does one phone call do that? Diyun didn't look away from the path ahead, but his hands relaxed slightly on the steering wheel. A business like Leclerc is built on a delusion of permanence, he said, his tone as clinical as a professor's. They project an image of invulnerability to justify their exclusion of others. But behind the white marble and the aesthetic policy, there is nothing but paper. He paused as the car came to a smooth halt. He turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the soft ambient light of the garage. They didn't own the building, Chantel. They leased it through a shell company that was over-leveraged on high-interest bridge loans. They were waiting for a private equity injection to stay afloat, money that was supposed to clear tonight. I didn't have to attack them. I simply bought the debt from the lender they were trying to escape. When I made that call, he continued, I moved the debt to a subsidiary I control. I triggered the on-demand repayment clause. In the eyes of the bank, Lecklet became a toxic asset in less than 60 seconds. I didn't use a hammer. I just removed the oxygen. Chantel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She realized then that his power wasn't just in the men he could command or the weapons he could wield. It was in his ability to see the invisible threads that held the world together, and his willingness to cut them if they dared to tangle around her. They thought they were protecting their brand, she whispered. They were protecting a ghost, Diyun replied. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the ruthlessness of his words. They were so busy deciding who was worthy of their tables that they forgot to check who owned the floor they were standing on. They treated you as an inconsistency. Now they're the ones who no longer fit the landscape. He stepped out of the car and opened her door, offering his hand. As she took it, she realized the city would wake up tomorrow to find a void where an empire once stood, all because a manager had failed to realize that the woman on the patio was the only person in the room who truly mattered. The digital silence of the penthouse was broken by the soft, persistent chime of Chantel's tablet resting on the mahogany nightstand. The glow of the screen cut through the dimness of the room, casting a sharp, white light against the silk hangings. She reached for it, her movements slow and heavy with the exhaustion of the night's emotional upheaval. The notification was not a news alert or a social media tag. It was a formal internal memo from the legal department of Han Global Holdings. The subject line was clinical and precise. Official notice of appointment. Executive Director, Horizon Hospitality Group. Chantel sat up, the silk sheets sliding off her shoulders as she read the words once, then twice, her breath catching in her throat. The Horizon Hospitality Group was the newly formed entity that had, as of 20 minutes ago, absorbed every asset, lease, and contract formerly held by the parent company of Lecklet. The document didn't just list her name, it outlined her absolute authority over the rebranding, the staffing, and the operational philosophy of the entire portfolio. Diyun, she whispered, her voice trembling as she looked toward the window where he stood, silhouetted against the waking city. The email, it says I'm the executive director. You didn't just buy the debt. You bought the entire group. He turned slowly, the light from the skyline catching the steady, unblinking intensity of his gaze. He didn't look like a man who had just spent millions on a whim. He looked like a man who had finished a necessary correction. I told you the inside no longer exists in the way they defined it, he said, his voice a low, resonant chord. If the world insists on creating barriers, then you'll be the one who decides where the doors are placed. Chantel looked back at the screen. The manager's face flashed through her mind, his smug reliance on aesthetic considerations and brand integrity. Now, by a simple stroke of a digital pen, he was no longer the gatekeeper. He was an employee in a company she owned. The very woman he had deemed an inconsistency was now the only person with the power to sign his final paycheck. You're putting me in charge of the people who insulted me, she said, the realization settling in her chest like a weight of cold iron. I am putting you in charge of the future, Diyun corrected. He walked toward her, the predatory edge of his earlier ruthlessness replaced by a quiet, unwavering support. They tried to hide you on a patio because they feared you didn't fit their vision. Now the vision is yours. You aren't just a guest anymore, Chantel. You are the owner of the room. She felt a surge of something more potent than revenge, a sense of sudden, absolute agency. The humiliation of the cold patio was being overwritten by the clinical reality of her new title. She wasn't sitting at the table. She was the one who owned the restaurant, the floor, and the very air the manager breathed. For the first time that night, the shivering stopped. The heavy oak doors of the shuttered restaurant groaned as they were pushed open, admitting a slice of the gray morning light. Inside, the aesthetic perfection of the previous night had been replaced by the sterile, frantic energy of a liquidation. Staff members moved in hushed circles, packing delicate crystal into crates, while the jazz had been replaced by the hollow echo of footsteps on marble. The manager stood in the center of the dining room, his silk tie loosened for the first time in years. His eyes were bloodshot, fixed on the legal notice pinned to the hostess's podium. He had spent the last 4 hours watching his kingdom dissolve, but the true weight of the collapse hadn't settled until the door to the private office opened. He expected a lawyer. He expected a cold, nameless auditor in a gray suit. Instead, Chantel stepped into the room. She wore a tailored power suit the color of midnight, her voluminous curls pinned back in a sharp, professional crown. She didn't look like the woman who had slouched in the cold patio chair. She looked like the person who owned the air he was currently breathing. The manager's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked past her, searching for Duyun, for the man he feared, but the hallway was empty. Chantel was alone. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a calm, melodic chime that carried more authority than a shout. She didn't wait for him to acknowledge her. She walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking against the stone with a rhythmic finality. "I believe you were overseeing the visual narrative of this establishment." Mrs. Hahn, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," the manager stammered, his hands trembling as he reached for a ledger. "I was merely following the directives of the previous holding group. We wanted to ensure the brand." "The brand is gone," Chantel interrupted, her gaze settling on him with a chilling, clinical focus. "The holding group was dissolved at midnight. I am the executive director of the new entity that holds your contract." The manager's knees seemed to weaken. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the realization finally broke across his face like a physical blow. The woman he had deemed an inconsistency, the person he had hidden away to protect his aesthetic, was now the only individual with the power to decide his future. "You aren't being fired, Mr. Sterling," Chantel continued, her tone dropping into a low, terrifyingly smooth register. "That would be too simple. Your contract has been reassigned to our logistics hub in the industrial district. You will be overseeing the inventory of the warehouse. It's a very private location. Secluded, away from the distractions of the public eye." She turned away, not waiting for his response. As she walked toward the exit, she didn't look at the empty tables or the marble she now owned. She had moved the outside into his world, and as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, she knew the manager would finally understand exactly how cold it felt to be erased. The penthouse was silent, the only sound the faint, distant hum of the city awakening far below. Duyun stood by the window, the morning light catching the sharp, clean lines of his charcoal suit. He hadn't changed, hadn't slept. He looked as though he had simply transitioned from one state of order to another. Chantel stood a few feet away, the weight of the new corporate appointment still warm in her mind, yet her heart was heavy with the sheer speed of the destruction he had unleashed. "You did all of this in 3 hours," she said, her voice a soft echo in the vast room. "I asked for a dinner, and you gave me an empire. But part of me wonders if it was just because you were angry. If you burned it all down just to see the manager's face fall." Duyun turned slowly. His expression was not one of a man who had acted in a fit of rage. His eyes were clear, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "Anger is a volatile fuel, Chantel. It burns hot, but it's imprecise. If I acted out of anger, I would have sent men to break windows. That would have been revenge, a temporary emotional release that solves nothing." He walked toward her, his movements fluid and deliberate. This wasn't revenge. It was a correction. In our world, every action is a data point. If I allowed that manager to treat you as an inconsistency, I would be setting a precedent that the Han name, and by extension my wife, could be marginalized for the sake of a seating chart. He stopped just inches from her, his presence a grounding force. A precedent is a rule that the world follows. If I didn't correct the boundary last night, the next restaurant would do the same. Then the next hotel. Then the next business partner. Status isn't just about luxury. It is about the structural integrity of how we are perceived. I didn't act because I was insulted. I acted because a structural defect was identified, and I had to ensure it could never happen again. Chantel looked into his dark eyes and saw the truth of it. He hadn't acted for the manager or even for the restaurant. He had acted for the future. He was building a world where her presence was never a question, and he was doing it with the cold, calculated efficiency of a man who knew that in the underworld, the only way to avoid a war was to make the cost of disrespect absolute. "You aren't just my husband," she whispered, the realization settling into her bones. "I am your partner," he replied, his hand coming up to rest gently against her cheek. "And a partner ensures that the ground beneath your feet is always solid. I didn't avenge you, Chantel. I restructured the city so that you would never have to be avenged again." The skyline of the city shimmered in the reflection of the river, a sprawling grid of light and shadow that seemed to hold its breath. Across the water, the building that had once housed Lecklet stood transformed. The construction crews had worked through the night with a silent, disciplined urgency, directed by the new oversight of Horizon Hospitality. The heavy glass partition that had once acted as a border between the worthy and the unwanted had been removed. The interior space expanded to flow seamlessly from the entrance to the very edge of the building. There was no longer an outside to be relegated to. Chantel stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the cool breeze catching the hem of her robe. Below, she could see the new signage being illuminated for the first time. It wasn't minimalist or whispered. The name was bold, etched in a timeless, high-contrast script that caught the light from the street below. It didn't lean on the crutch of exclusivity to define its value. It stood as a testament to a new era of leadership, one where the aesthetic was defined by the dignity of the guest, not the bias of the host. Dune stepped out onto the balcony, his presence a quiet, stabilizing warmth at her back. He didn't speak, but he followed her gaze to the glowing landmark across the river. He had kept his promise. He hadn't just burned a bridge. He had built a monument to the fact that his wife would never be placed behind a pane of glass again. "It's different," Chantel said softly, her voice carrying a newfound weight of authority. "The air feels different over there now." "Because the precedent has been established," Dune replied, his voice a low, final resonance. "The city now knows that the Han name does not tolerate a division of space." "You didn't just step inside, Chantel. You removed the concept of the outside entirely." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The sting of the previous night had been overwritten by a cold, clinical victory, a transformation that was more permanent than any apology. The manager was in a warehouse, the hostess was gone, and the brand that had tried to erase her was now a footnote in her own portfolio. As the sun began to climb higher, gilding the glass towers of the district, Chantel realized that the normalcy she had once craved was a small thing compared to the agency she now held. She wasn't just a customer, and she wasn't just a wife. She was the architect of a world where she belonged by right, and beside her stood the man who had made it so. The river flowed on, steady and deep, carrying the remains of the old world away, leaving only the strength of what they had built together. That night started with humiliation on a cold terrace and ended with the city learning a lesson it would never forget. Respect is not something people should grant only when they recognize power. It is something every human being deserves from the very beginning. The manager believed status came from controlling who was allowed inside the room. But real power came from the people he tried to push outside. In the end, the walls he used to divide people disappeared, and the woman he dismissed became the one who decided who walked through the door. Never judge someone by appearance, status, or what you think they deserve. The quiet person you ignore today may be the one who changes everything tomorrow. True strength is not just about wealth or influence. It's about standing up for dignity, loyalty, and the people you love. If this story moved you, taught you something, or kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful story. There are many more stories of hidden power, respect, and unforgettable justice coming your way. Thanks for staying with us. Stay blessed and stay beautiful.